Hello, my name is Mia Bradley, and today I will be talking to you about the effects of apex predator abundance on the abundance of mesopredators. In case you aren't aware, an apex predator is something that we would call a keystone species. These are going to be your really big animals, such as your wolves, black bears, grizzly bears, the animals that sit at the top of the food chain in their respective ecosystems. On the other hand, a mesopredator is a smaller animal that typically competes with this apex predator for similar resources such as food, water, and shelter. These animals are going to be things like coyotes, foxes, any animal in the mustelid family, possums, raccoons, skunks. So the smaller omnivorous, semi-carnivorous animals that will be fighting with these apex predators for the same resources. Because of this competition between these two levels of predators, we think that the apex predators can influence the species composition and the abundance of mesopredators in the areas where they're present. Likewise, in areas where there are no apex predators, mesopredator abundance is most likely going to increase because there is no apex predator pressure keeping their populations down. In order to test this hypothesis, we used data gathered from roughly 1,500 camera traps that were deployed at 110 different locations in the United States. This deployment of camera traps was a bigger part of a bigger project called Snapshot USA that looks to deploy as many camera traps as possible to look at species diversity, richness, and species composition across areas in the United States. Using the data that was gathered from this 2019 data, we looked at the abundance of mesopredators and we also looked at the abundance of apex predators. And then we looked at the relation of these two abundances in relation to each other when you had species that were crossing in the same area. So if you look at our first figure on the left here, this figure with the graph right here, you'll find that the total mesopredator abundance when there are apex predators present versus not present changes significantly. In sites where there are no apex predator species at all, so apex predators have either been exasperated or they're locally extinct, you'll see that the abundance of mesopredators is fairly high because there's no external apex predator pressure keeping their populations down. As you begin to increase the number of apex predator species you see, the abundance of mesopredators begins to decrease because they're now competing with a larger animal for these resources. And the number of apex predator species is variant, so you might have one in one site, but you might have, for example, in national parks, you might have two or more apex predator species that are working to keep the species abundance of mesopredators down. For a note, mesopredator abundance was simply calculated by determining the number of detections a mesopredator was caught. So, in other words, the number of times a camera trap went off and caught a animal that was considered a mesopredator, and this was simply divided by the number of the days that the camera trap was deployed, and this is what gives us our mesopredator abundance. The apex predator abundance similarly was calculated that way and then put on this axis. If we move down below, you'll find that, we looked at the mesopredator abundance compared to the number of apex predators detected. And again, we see very similar results. If there is a site where there is no apex predator detected at all, so nothing was caught in the camera trap, you'll find that the abundance of mesopredator detections goes way up because there's nothing fighting with them for the resources in the area. As you begin to increase the number of apex predators, and once you get up to more than two species of apex predators, you find that the mesopredator populations are really suppressed, again, because they are competing with these apex predators, so that could be leading to lower population sizes of mesopredators when there's increased competition for resources. Finally, if we come back up to this figure here, this is the relative abundance of mesopredators when there are apex predators present. You'll see that, again, when there are no apex predators around, you'll find way more mesopredators. You'll also notice that when there are no apex predators, which is also reflected in this first graph, that the composition or species composition of mesopredators is much more leaned towards the smaller animal, mainly in this case the raccoon, but also some possums and some foxes. As you start to add the predators back in, you'll notice that the abundance of raccoons, foxes, and all of these other animals that were initially dominating begins to decrease. And by the time you've gotten to having two or more apex predators, you find that species composition is fairly diverse, and you'll notice that coyotes begin to encroach into column here, indicating that they are having an easier time competing with the apex predators, while at the same time most likely helping to suppress the smaller mesopredators as they might prey on them for a food resource. So this tells us that there is something going on between when you continue to add apex predator species and when you look at the species composition of mesopredators. In other words, something about the diversity of mesopredators and apex predators is being affected here. Mainly, we think that maybe apex predator diversity directly correlates to the diversity of mesopredators in the ecosystem, but more information and data is needed to test this theory. So, in other words, our study finds a strong correlation between the potential effects of apex predators and mesopredators, and we do find correlation between when you have apex predators present and what that does to your mesopredator populations. Mainly that as you begin to increase the apex predator species diversity, your mesopredator species diversity begins to change, it becomes more diverse, and the abundance of mesopredators begins to decrease as they are being forced to compete with these apex predators for the similar resources. That is my poster, and thank you for coming to my talk.